So welcome and thank you to everybody that's tuning in, that has already tuned in. Thank you for joining us for the second part of our two-part webinar series on demystifying consumer and community involvement in research. Just very quickly, for those of you who are not aware, the White Coats Foundation was established by myself and my colleague Fiona Cameron in recognition of the need to raise awareness about the role of clinical trials in advancing medical science and healthcare. We are a not-for-profit DGR registered charity, and we undertake a variety of initiatives that are aimed at educating healthcare professionals, patients, carers, consumers, the general public on the role of research in healthcare. Today's webinar is just one example of the many initiatives that we undertake. And if you want to learn more about the work of the White Coats Foundation, please feel free to visit our website or to reach out to any one of us directly. In our journey and through the work that we do, we have discovered that there is some confusion that exists about clinical trial participation versus consumer and community involvement in research. That knowledge is what's inspired this webinar series. So the first session in this series last week was really focused on providing some clarity and some definitions around consumer and community involvement in research. We also looked at the different types of roles consumers can hold, and also the training options available to support consumers interested in becoming involved in research. If you missed that webinar, a copy of the session is available as a recording on our website, and you can access that if you want to catch up on the conversation there. So now that we have that knowledge in place, today we really want to focus on how can consumers learn about or access opportunities to be involved in research. What are the barriers to consumer and community involvement in research from a consumer perspective and from a researcher perspective? And when these relationships are formed, how do we ensure that they are value adding and that it's not just a tokenistic exercise? We have a wonderful panel joining us this afternoon to help us address some of these topics. And my colleague, Michelle DeVito-Smith, who is the Head of Patient Experience and Stakeholder Engagement at White Coats Foundation, will be facilitating the conversation this afternoon. I will be monitoring the Q&A channel. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to be brought into the discussion, please put them into the Q&A. You can use the chat function for general conversation, but anything that you want brought into this discussion, please put it into Q&A. I can't promise you that I will be able to bring in everyone's comments and questions into the discussion today. It really depends on the volume and the time we have, but I will endeavour to get back to people after the webinar if we don't address any of your questions or comments this afternoon. We have learned that we could probably dedicate much more than an hour to this webinar series for each session. We learn as we go, but it is the beginning of a very big conversation. And so just in the interest of time, I'm now going to hand over to Michelle so that we can get things started. So over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Christine, for that introduction. I'd like to just welcome all our panelists today and all our attendees on the line. Welcome. First of all, I just want to quickly go through our wonderful panelists we have. Anne McKenzie, who's a pioneer in CCI and a consumer advocate from Telethon Kids. Welcome, Anne. Leanne Hunt, cancer consumer and advocate. Welcome, Lee. To Sarah Lukeman, who's a community engagement coordinator at Hunter Cancer Research Alliance. Welcome, Sarah. Angela Todd, who's the research director at Sydney Health Partners. Welcome, Angela. To George Kiosoglu, consumer representative at WeHi and MAC and ARA CCI initiative. Welcome, George. To Associate Professor Christine Schaefer, who's the head of Cancer Cell Plasticity at the Cancer Cell Plasticity Laboratory at the Garvan Institute. Welcome to you, Christine. Thanks for attending today. To Lisa Carstairs, who's a consumer advocate and a consumer representative at Cancer Voices. Welcome, Lisa. And last but not least, to Kathy Florick, who actually joins us from Princeton, New Jersey. She's Director of Head of Engagement Strategy at Bristol Myers Squibb. Thank you, Kathy, for joining us at an ungodly hour of 11 p.m. your time. So I really appreciate you joining us today to be able to give us a pharmaceutical industry perspective of this conversation. Now, in the spirit of collaboration, the panelists here with us today will be sharing their views and opinions based on their experiences in CCI. It would be greatly appreciated to be mindful of this as we learn from each other to improve consumer involvement in research. So our first discussion topic today, as Christine has just recently alluded to, is how can consumers learn and access opportunities to be involved in research? Now, Angela, in the work that you have done at ARA, in terms of the national survey on CCI that was undertaken in 2018, having a clear and simple pathway for connecting with consumers and community members was one of the main factors out of 8 that was identified by the survey respondents. What is ARA doing to address that?
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And hello to everyone out in Australia. It's really funny having a conversation with people you can't see. First of all, let me please acknowledge the lands on which I am today, which are the Camaragal lands of northern Sydney in New South Wales. And welcome to all of you on the various lands on which you stand, and let me pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you for this question too, Michelle. So ARA is the Australian Health Research Alliance, and it's I guess a collaboration across organisations throughout Australia that are working to create partnerships between research, health services and consumers to try and improve the use of research to improve healthcare. So I'm just very conscious, I've got a gorgeous Labrador sleeping beside me. It's boring. It feels very loud in my...
No, we can't hear anything.
I'm sorry. If he was smaller, I'd throw him out. So ARA is quite a powerful collaboration because across our members throughout Australia, we have about 80% of health service delivery organisations, most major hospitals, community health services, but we also have about 90% of health and medical researchers. So the power of the partnership is terrific. And one of the areas that we quite early on agreed to work on together was in the area of strengthening consumer involvement in research. And as we learned at last week's DeMystifying lecture, we are talking about involvement, not participation as subjects of research, but involvement as partners in research. And so ARA has done a number of things that are really intended to provide agreed upon frameworks and processes. And so the survey that you referred to, Michelle, that was in 2018, we had nearly 1,000 people across Australia, consumers, researchers, clinicians, all responding to the survey. And really what we were trying to understand is what are people using, what tools and resources are people using to try and work together as partners in research. And that was quite revealing. And if you're interested, there is a report on the ARA website. There's an executive report that's not too long, and then there's the giant report, which is about 80 pages. But there's a lot of information. There are a lot of tools and resources out there on websites. Organisations have developed them. But I think the question that you're asking specifically is really about how consumers can learn about and access research. And I think there are a number of things that are happening at the moment. Consumers Health Forum of Australia has a very effective mailing, a messaging service each week, each fortnight. If you're not on that mailing list and you're interested in hearing about research, there are often research opportunities in their email messages. In New South Wales, I know Health Consumers New South Wales, which is our peak advocacy group for health consumers. They're also very good at promoting opportunities to their mailing list, which I think is largely consumer-based. around opportunities for, being involved in research, being involved in committees that influence research. So there are consumer-based organisations that are really promoting opportunities for research. And I think a lot of consumers are hearing about it that way. I think there are disease-specific groups, whether it be cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, where there are really, I think, genuine efforts to try and let people know about research opportunities specific to those disease or special interest groups. On the flip side, we're also doing some work which is around trying to help researchers develop some skills and strategies around reaching out to consumers, because it might be a little bit surprising, but a lot of researchers don't actually know how to reach out to consumers. And I think we had a bit of a discussion before this session started that, we often receive inquiries from junior researchers, which is, I'm looking for a consumer with some experience in X, and do you happen to know someone who could do it? And I sort of feel like they must think I have a shelf with consumers and I've got tags on them and I can just pop one out. And it's not like that, like if you want to be a collaborative research partner, you develop a relationship with other researchers and you get to know them, you get to know what they're good at, you know which projects to involve them in, which ones they're not so good a fit for. And I think it's true with consumers. I think we as researchers need to start reaching out to consumers and saying, we've got a genuine commitment to creating partnerships with consumers to work with us in research. You won't necessarily be interested in all of the research we do, but we'd really like to get involved in having conversations with you and engaging you in projects where you are interested, because we really love your input. So I think there are opportunities on both sides, researchers and consumers, to work together and to learn about opportunities to be involved in different kinds of projects. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Angela. That's wonderful. And thank you for providing us with some clear guidance in for consumers in particular to be able to connect with, for example, the Consumer Health Forum weekly opportunities and to express their interest through that organisation, also the New South Wales organisation. So thank you for sharing that today. Now, Lee, you were involved in CCI research back in 2014 for the Cancer Council. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved and how you heard about that training and what prompted you to do it.
Yeah. Look, I had just retired and after a career in education, and I was looking to do other activities besides, twiddle my thumbs. And I joined a few activities at the Cancer Council New South Wales. And it was one of their newsletters that came out saying, would you like to be trained for being involved in cancer research? And because my treatment, my cancer type, they still don't know what causes it. So I thought, yes, that's great. I'll get involved in this. And so I undertook the training, and then they suggested that you join a consumer group, and that's when I joined Cancer Voices. So my name went from Cancer Council onto the Cancer Voices list of consumers that year, and then I started working with researchers from that date. But it really can be a little bit hit or miss with finding consumers. Now, the system set up at Cancer Voice is quite well established now. It's been going for several years. And so researchers contact Cancer Voices via the website and request a consumer, and details are put down to make a match. But of course, as research is becoming a lot more specific and targeted therapies, that matching is getting harder and harder to do. I don't actually do the matching anymore. It's taken over by someone else this year. But it is actually quite a demanding role to do that matching, because last year there were 82 requests for consumers, and a lot of that was to consumers. So it took a lot of time and energy. But in my role, I've actually spoken to various groups, and one was PhD researchers at Sydney University on a range of health types, and they had real trouble finding avenues to get consumers to work with them. And so I think there needs to be a dedicated site or a process in place to match researchers to appropriate consumers. I'm talking outside of cancer at the moment. The matching, as I said, is very labour intensive, and that's a problem in itself, because if you're a volunteer organisation, it does mean a lot of time from one person to do the matching. There's a lot of emails. There's a lot of people don't answer their emails. You need to be very specific, so you need to have really good details about your consumers and their experiences. So that's another major issue. I also, as I talked about last week, I think there needs to be training for consumers, but it's got to be across all areas of health. And most areas of health acknowledge there is a problem of no training for consumers, and there's no training for researchers. So that's another issue that I perceive in the area. And also,
can I interject? So with the disease, group experience, the matching, of the researcher to the consumer, is there a prerequisite that the consumer has a level of understanding of the basic science of that area?
Yeah. Well, in the Cancer Council and Cancer Voices training, there is online modules that go through that basic science. And so that's how it's been. It takes about 2 hours to do it. Right. There's 4 modules, and that really does give a really good overview of the basic science.
Right. Lisa, can I cut to you? Because I know that, given your experience as a consumer representative, do you feel that, your background has really supported what you're doing to partner with Christine?
Yeah, definitely. So I've got a background primarily in health anyway, so 15 years with the federal government, and then with a medical college for a couple of years, and working primarily with Aboriginal health organisations. So I have got a pretty solid background in health. I must say that doesn't always help with the research, because the research can be complicated, but I'm very lucky to work with Christine, because she explains the complexities of the research in plain English to me. So, I'm not backwards in coming forwards, as they say, when it comes to stuff that I don't understand. But I think with some of the research, there is some complexity to it that I don't think the training that I did with Cancer Voices covers all of that. So it'd be great to have something else that you could sort of go to, probably for people who are more sort of generalist coming into wanting to be a consumer rep for research.
Thanks for that. Yeah, because Lee, you had direct experience, lived experience with cancer, and you got to really probably become more educated, as you went along.
You actually, your skills develop as you go on, because I think I've spoken about before, I've had an issue of side effect of cardiotoxicity from my cancer treatment. And I've learned, and I'm now working with some cardiovascular researchers too. Now, I've never had science at all in my background. My background is education and economics. So, for me, that is, it was difficult, but your knowledge builds up as you go on. I've been doing this now for over 7 years. So with working with researchers, so I think that, yes, initially it is really difficult, but as time goes on, you build up those skills. But I'd also like to say now, it's important that it goes across health areas, because as a lot of health areas are multifaceted. So one therapy might lead to another health issue. So you've got comorbidities. So, training needs to be broad to make sure that you're looking at the skills that you can bring in as a consumer to all areas of health research.
Thank you, Lee. And you brought up a really good point about, you know, matching researchers to consumers. And I think for any entrepreneurs out there, I think there would be a great opportunity for an app of some kind, because as you say, researchers are getting more specific about the consumer that they're wanting to involve in their research. So I'm just putting it out there to other panelists about sharing their experiences about matching and, you know, how time consuming it is and how you manage to do it.
And I thought I saw you putting your hand up before. you just take yourself off mute, yes.
I have. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the Noongar Nation in Perth to join you all. When in my previous role at UWA and the University of Western Australia, and the West Australian Health Translation Network, before ARA became a body, we set up a matching service. And when I finished in 2019 with the Consumer and Community Health Research Network, and I know it's got a different name now, I'm not sure what it is, there were 3,000 people on that network. And yes, it was time consuming, but I didn't think it was too time consuming. And it was based very loosely on Cancer Council New South Wales matching service that they'd done, you know, several years earlier. You know, it was really important that those relationships worked. And there's no good of putting someone who is interested in left toe research to someone that wants to do ear research. So I think that that's a really important thing. And we set up a process. I'm not sure, I'm sure it in some form or another is still being used by that network, but at Telethon Kids, we certainly continue to use it. And, you know, it's very important that, you know, for the relationship to work, you know, people have got to be aligned in what each is working. So I think that's where, you know, that first initial meeting comes up, whether it's virtual or in face-to-face, about what do both parties want to get out of the involvement activities. And just one other point I'd like to make a comment about, I don't think you have to have a science background to be a good consumer rep or member of a research team. I still don't understand a lot of the terminology because I never wanted to understand it. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scientist. I've worked for lots and lots of decades now as a consumer advocate, and that's what I see, the strength that I bring. So I think people need to, if you're interested in research, Lisa, and you want to do extra training, that's fantastic. But if you're not, I've got a head full and I don't particularly want to know about meta-analysis and systematic reviews because there's experts there for that. And the expertise that I might bring is as a consumer member of a team. So just to add that.
Very good point there. Yeah. Very good point. And that gives inspiration to, you know, consumers out there that are interested, that they don't need to have a background, you know, that they are pushing the agenda for the consumer in support of the research. So thank you, Anne.
You know, I just would add one last thing about that. You know, over the time, you might meet someone who's got a child who's got, you know, leukemia or something, and they would say to me, oh, I can't be involved in research. I'm just a mum. But their knowledge is massive. And, you know, someone who's got kids of diabetes or whatever, their knowledge is massive. So, you know, they bring that to the table. So thank you.
Thank you. George, would you like to say?
I'm going to agree with everything that Anne said because we sort of, but I'll make a couple of other points. One, that we hire, when we recruit people, we tell them you don't need to know about science. You will pick some things up. It's actually in my experience, it's been a really good thing not knowing about science because it then forces the researchers to get out of their, I'm going to say bubble, but it's probably the wrong term.
Comfort zone.
Comfort zone, well, it's even more that, the way that they work. to be able to talk a different language and to be able to explain things differently. And I've seen a lot of examples of that with a lot of the researchers I work with. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things. Communication is a huge thing in this, and developing relationships. I think from a consumer point of view, that with a researcher, that's a really important focus. And getting to know each other, as Anne said, in your first meeting, sort of setting up guidelines, setting up expectations of what you're going to do. You're not going to do everything straight away, and then it gradually becomes a journey along the way. The matching, I agree, is really, really important. If you don't get a good match, it can be terrible and kill everyone's experience. So, yeah, like I said, I think everything that Anne has said is right, and everyone has said here is right. I'd love to know how the app is going to work, but that's because I've got an IT background and there's a whole lot of other issues with that as well.
That could be for you, George.
Yeah, no.
We can talk later, George.
And so if we get back to to our topic one, to our question, just to leave the question, I guess just to as a last question, where would be a good place for a consumer or research to go to actually be able to connect with a consumer if they're a researcher, or vice versa right now? I know, Angela, you've mentioned, the Cancer Health Forum, the New South Wales group. Which group was that?
Sorry, I was talking about Health Consumers New South Wales.
Health Consumers New South Wales, that's right. And also disease-specific groups. Is there anywhere else, if we've got consumers on the line today that really want to get involved, where else can they go to? In
Victoria, they can go to the Health Issues Centre, and that's already been mentioned by some people in the chat.
Right.
You could try the cancer councils directly, some of them, and certainly in Cancer Council Victoria, they've got a network set up as well. There's a few websites. There's the VCCA website as well about consumer involvement. So they're just some of them around in Victoria.
Yeah.
It sounds like it happens quite ad hoc, randomly and by chance. And so the sense or the feeling I'm getting is that there probably needs to be a resource where researchers can broadcast these opportunities and consumers can actually connect to these opportunities, and some sort of matching process can take place across all disciplines. So maybe that's the takeaway here, and it's something that we could explore in another conversation. And I'll definitely be picking your brain for that one as well, considering the experience you talked about, the matching program. And Lee, Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think also I have a consumer advisory panel out of the Hunter Medical Research Institute in the Hunter. And I know at Monash Uni at the Alfred Hospital, they've set up a consumer panel. So I think there's more and more research institutes are also setting up consumer groups for researchers to assist researchers and to facilitate that connection.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great for it to be in one place?
Well, you're never going to get one place because I think consumers are all different. And I think it's also, as well as your disease specific, don't forget if you're doing research and into Aboriginal health, for example, to reach out to the local Aboriginal medical service. If you're looking for culturally diverse groups, there's all those language groups as well and cultural groups. You don't need to keep to a disease when you're going out to consumers. Anybody can be a consumer. And just touching back on a few things that have been said about, you don't have to have a science background. You're there to provide a lived experience. And it's really the job of the researcher to explain it to you. And if they can't do that, then they need to try again.
Yeah, no, I would really echo what Sarah's just said. And just quickly to add to the end of this question is that if you're trying to find a consumer, there needs to be a range of methods. You can't just say, well, I'll try this avenue or that. You know, you need to go through Twitter, Facebook, personal requests. You could ask clinicians. There's networking events. So there's a range of different avenues that as a researcher you need to be involved in to help you find the right consumer for you.
Thank you, Lee. Now let's move on to our second question. What are the barriers to consumer involvement? And we've touched on a main one just now with the matching, but what are the barriers for the researchers and what are the barriers for the consumers here? And I'd like to invite George, given your experience as a consumer representative, what do you feel the barriers are?
So some of the barriers are things like we just mentioned, not knowing where to go, not knowing where to look for it. But before that, it's actually some of the barriers are researchers not understanding the value that consumers can bring and sort of going through we want it as a tick in the box because the granting body says we need a consumer. That is still there. It's getting a lot less, certainly in the cancer space. But it's also barriers like the research organisations or the hospitals or whoever not so much not seeing the value, but not feeling it's as important as doing the actual research itself. There are other issues such as, and it was touched on by Sarah, on the called community and language barriers and cultural barriers as to how you engage consumers. Because engaging me is totally different than engaging a person of Middle Eastern descent, simply because, you know, the way that they communicate, the way they work, and the same with Indigenous people as well. So there's those. The other barrier, and it's one that I've just realised more and more, is technology. Because as we get more and more applications and communications and Zoom and everything like that, if you don't have good technology, the experience isn't going to be great and it may put you off. And if I go further in on that, there's another aspect of this that I'm learning more and more, and that's that if you're not, as a consumer, if you don't feel that you're valued by your researcher and you're not getting feedback on what they're learning from you, etc., then that becomes a barrier to wanting to continue to be a consumer. So I think that's an area that needs to be looked at as well. Do I keep going? Can I flip this for a moment and say one of the things that I really enjoyed doing last year for the VCCC, as it was then, was being part of the Master of Cancer Science program. And that was me talking about consumer involvement and me being able to get across to a whole lot of new students and getting in early. And I think that's one of the solutions to these barriers. It's not just knowing about it, it's about getting researchers and PhD students early to get them to understand the value.
That's a really good point, George. It's actually integrating that into the academic curriculum, you know, for science students, for, you know, medical students in the future. Yeah, that's a great point.
Just had a quick question from one of our attendees, just saying, is there an ethics process for involving consumers with research projects if they're not actually clinical trial or research participants?
Yeah, given one of my hats is on an ethics committee, this is an interesting question. If they're not on a clinical trial, my experience has been, no, I don't have an ethic. There's no ethics requirement other than me sometimes helping put together an ethics proposal. But there's nothing, and Anne wants to say something, so I'll flick it over to her now.
Look, we've looked at this long and hard over the time. There is no ethics requirement in this country for involvement any more than you would have to have ethics requirement to have a biostatistician or a research nurse as part of your research team. So of course, if you are going to analyse the involvement activities, you might want to include that, but to have a person on as part of your research project, no, there's not. So I wanted to put that in because I think that's often a barrier that people think they can't do it because they'd have to get ethics approval, but no, you don't.
Sarah.
Yeah, I agree, and I think flip it on the head. It's unethical to not include consumers because these are the people that the research is being done for. So there's an ethical requirement to involve them.
So do you think that might be something, to look at in the future with the, we use the NH and MRC templates, HREA templates when we're submitting our applications to ethics committees. I've just done this recently and there was not one question about consumer involvement in that process at all. So perhaps it's Anne, as you've said, this has come up before, perhaps this is something that could be included, at least that a consumer has been consulted in the review of the research and has had a say and a voice in that research.
Just if I might respond to that, Michelle, we, I've been raising, I sat on NH and MRC's or the National Health and Medical Research Council's community and consumer advisory group for some years. And I raise that regularly and continue to raise that when and how and wherever that, ethics applications should have a question to say, have consumers been involved in the development of this research project? Because, I think that would give a level of comfort to an ethics group. And I have sat on one of those that the community has had a say in what's being put forward.
Totally agree. Angela, do you have a comment?
Look, I just wanted to add, I know it's come through in the chat a bit, but one of the other big barriers is around language. I don't think researchers sometimes appreciate just how foreign their language can be. And even in the conversations we've had right now, we just use acronyms like NHMRC or AREC or that's part of our world, and we forget that those aren't necessarily part of the consumer's world. And as professionals, we have to be mindful about, talking to people, in terms that everybody understands. And I think researchers do need a bit of a beating up around the head sometimes because they do forget. And I'm one of them, so I can say that.
I see a lot of nodding of heads on that point, Angela, as you speak. I just wanted to, getting back to this actual question, Sarah, I know that you've said to me in conversation that one of the barriers to consumer and community involvement in research from a researcher perspective is that they're often a bit scared of approaching consumers. There's this fear factor. Can you talk to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so my experience is as a cancer survivor, and I work with cancer researchers, and a number of them, particularly younger people who themselves don't have a huge, wide lived experience to draw upon, are really worried about upsetting a patient by asking them questions. And so I have two main responses to that. The first is, these are people who've chosen to be involved and to share their story with researchers. They've usually either finished active treatment or are doing a sort of in long-term chronic care, chronic treatment now. They have a degree of perspective on their story. It's not something I myself was about. I'd had 3 years of treatment. I didn't really get involved until about 10 years later. When I was well and I had the energy and the headspace to do it as well. So that's the first thing. They tend to be fairly resilient and not easily upset. But conversely, so what if they get upset? You know, cancer sucks and it's okay to get upset. It's not the end of the world, you know, they'd have been upset before. And so particularly for younger researchers, you know, if you yourself are uncomfortable with that, I recommended, and this is available through the University of Newcastle, to do accidental counsel training, for example, so that they can just build up those interpersonal skills. And that's a great skill for everybody to have anyway. So there's things that you can do that aren't strictly about consumer involvement. Nobody likes picking up a phone and making a cold call to somebody. And I think that's the greatest barrier in all of this, is actually stepping out of your comfort zone, contacting somebody you don't necessarily know. We keep talking about researchers, but I want to also just highlight, you know, clinicians and clinician researchers, particularly with clinical trials. They'll often, unlike a lab-based researcher, they're seeing patients all the time. And they'll go, oh, you know, I can see consumers all the time. But that's quite different sitting in the surgery and talking to your patients. A consumer is somebody, it's a different conversation you'd be having. And if you, I know that I have clinicians who've referred consumers to do training and become involved in research. But the conversation as a clinician that you would have with a consumer who's involved with a clinical trial is quite different to the conversation you might have with that same person as a patient. It needs to be done and approached differently.
It's also, you know, we also need the time, I guess, for the consumer and researcher to build a relationship. It's not going to happen instantaneously, and we'll move to the next question, to which Christine and Lisa will talk to. But it like any relationship, like a marriage, a friendship, etc., it's going to take time. And you know, rather than making it so transactional and, you know, removing the emotion, you know, the emotion needs to come in, and we're humans at the end of the day. So I think that's an important element of establishing that partnership. So let's move to our third question that we have on the agenda today. How do we ensure consumer involvement in research is value-adding and not just tokenistic? And, you know, speaking to all these lovely panelists, a lot of them are, you know, reviewers of grants, and often, you know, the consumer voice is required to secure funding for the researcher. So how can we make that more meaningful so that it's the consumer voice is not just a last minute, I need this for my grant, but rather I really want to hear from the consumer that it's really going to make my research more impactful to the greater good and to the community. So I'd like to invite Associate Professor Christine Schaefer and Lisa Carstairs, who have a wonderful researcher-consumer relationship. And, you know, please tell us about your relationship, how it started, and what are the elements that have made it so successful?
Shall I start, Lisa? Okay. Me. Thank you to Whitecoats for inviting me to share our story today too, because echoing everything that's been said by the other members of the panelists, it's really, it can be a really daunting process for the researchers as well. So for what you've mentioned, we're scared, you know, sometimes to approach people, scared of saying the wrong thing, scared of not, you know, making ourselves clear, and also scared of wasting time, you know. And then there's that other side of it too, that you know, a lot of the times the reasons that you're reaching out to consumers is because you have to.
you need that tick box. And this is where I really think that my experiences have really changed my mentality about that. And sure, we really did start off, I need to tick a box. We need consumer advocates. And so I was lucky enough to reach out to Lee Hunt, who did her amazing matching and got put in contact with Lisa as well. And yes, at the start, I think as daunting as it is, you really do have to dive in and have those conversations. And so for me, it was actually a couple of emails and then cold calling Lisa. We eventually got on the phone together. And at that point, when I spoke to Lisa, I thought, this chick's so cool. We're going to have a great time. And, you know, so, and I think that's really important. You have to be able to connect with your consumers. And if you can't, I think it's really challenging. So I think building that relationship is really important, and it takes time. There are coffees that, you know, we've had with Lee in the past. And as you get to feel a bit more comfortable with people, and then you get that opportunity for the consumers to also say, as Lisa would say, just try again. I don't understand, you know, give it to me again. And so you do get to practice about how you can communicate better. But honestly, I think that once you have had a little bit of time to build that relationship, one of the things that I decided to do for my lab was to bring Lee and Lisa into the lab so that they could meet everybody and that we could actually sit down and have a conversation. And as scary as that was at the time too, you wonder, how is this going to go? You realize how lovely and how willing to share Lisa was, and to, you know, talk about her story and so openly. And it was really mind-blowing for my lab to actually hear their stories and to start to appreciate what they're doing as scientists. Because, you know, you have this scientific career and we have these goals, we want to discover new biology, but there is this huge element of actually you're not appreciating or connecting with why you're actually doing it. And sure, there are people who have firsthand experience, and for them it's really raw, and they know exactly why they're doing their research. For others, they need to understand and see the people, you know, and hear. And actually, that experience of listening to Lisa's story in my lab really was so impactful for all of us scientists to understand. I think we're actually, you know, going to make a difference in someone's lives. You know, it's not just a lab bench experience. And that was really transformative. So I think that, you know, taking that time to build the relationships, it takes time. And once you can get to that stage, then you get a lot more out of it. Even for me, I must admit, I started off going, this is a tick box, I need to do this. And then you understand that actually I'm learning a lot. I'm understanding so much more. And I think we have to be able to get the researchers over that hump, that this is something I have to do, to actually, this is something that I'm really going to gain from.
Christine, has it changed the objectives of your research, given the experience?
Yeah, look, I think so. So being able to even ask those questions, you know, we do experiments, we use different types of chemotherapies to try. And, you know, some of those, hearing those stories from Lisa, but, you know, that chemotherapy was terrible. I don't want that, you know. And, you know, Lisa, the same, the cardiac toxicity, we don't think about those things. We use the chemotherapy, and if it works, we're amazing. You're not thinking about, actually, these chemotherapies have different impacts on patients. And could we change it up? Could we try a different one? Like, what pairs are we using? Why are we using these different things? So yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Christine. Lisa.
Hi. I forgot before, but first, can I just say I'm proudly speaking from Gadigal land today, because I live in inner Sydney, and pay my respects to my elders, past, present, and emerging. So thank you for having me on this land. I'd just like to say that I really love the process of being a consumer in research. Like, I get so much out of it, and I don't mind talking about my cancer journey, because it's kind of complex and all over the place, but I just love talking about it and meeting new people. And Christine and her team have been amazing and engaging, and I can see the difference that the research is doing, and that's ultimately why I'm participating, is to make a difference for future generations, and ultimately so someone doesn't actually have to go through the hideousness that I went through at the time. I just hope things change so much because, yeah, cancer is a bit of a pain in everywhere. And the chemotherapy that we've been talking about with Christine and her team would just make such a difference. So back to the ultimate question, is for us, we've got a great partnership, I think. And it started out really great. Like even just the first conversation that we had was about clearly articulating the relationship that we were going to have, how I was going to be involved in the research, the objectives of the research and that kind of thing, and what the expectations of the team were of me ultimately. And I think that really helps as well. Like it's a time thing. So I think a lot of people think that it's going to actually take a lot of time out of your life, and it doesn't have to. Like, I mean, I think I probably said from the outset, like, I've got spare time on weekends. I can give you this amount of time. I can do stuff after work. Does that fit in with what ultimately, you know, is that going to fit in with you? Because if it doesn't, I haven't got more time. That's kind of it. So setting out those expectations initially was really, really good, and it was really easy. And we did have a great rapport from the outset.
Lisa, are you remunerated at all, or any of the consumers involved remunerated for their time and contribution?
I'm not. I do it purely from the goodness of my heart. I personally wouldn't expect to be remunerated. That would be a question for Lee, I would say, because I am part of the Cancer Voices team. And I know some of the work that I've done from my health background, we do remunerate our consumers, but that's never something that I would expect myself.
Thanks, Lisa.
Can I just say, I think that you've provided a really great example of what an effective and value-adding relationship looks like. How do we then go about measuring that impact? I know, Angela, too, you've done some work with ARA. You're looking at tools to be able to measure impact. Would anyone like to speak to that? And then I'm also conscious of time, that we'd love to hear from you, Kathy, as well.
Yes, I've got a few questions
you're doing. Yeah. So, Angela, maybe do you want to make comment on that?
I'll make a quick one just to give Kathy some time, given that she stayed up all hours for
That's right.
But I think the question of impact is really important. I've had a lot of consumers want proof that the contributions they're making are really making a difference, because people feel like it is. But, you know, we researchers, we always want to have sort of objective evidence that it is. And I think there's a number of things to consider. One is that how you involve consumers in research will influence the kind of impacts they can have. So, you know, if you involve consumers in helping decide on the research question, then the impact is that you actually might change the nature of the question because you've had really good input, and it's a question that really is important to consumers rather than necessarily to researchers. That's a different kind of impact from, for example, if you involve consumers in designing how you go about a survey with consumers about lived experience of dialysis or something. And so then their influence is actually around asking meaningful questions that participants respond to. So I think, I don't think it's easy. And I think if you do want to evaluate impact, you need to think about, well, what kind of involvement are we asking of consumers, and therefore what kind of impacts could we look for? And there are tools that are available to help guide you through some of those questions. But I don't think there is going to ever be one tool that works for all kinds of research, all kinds of consumer involvement, and therefore able to measure any kind of impact. So I think we need to be flexible around that.
And just to round that off, wouldn't it be great if the open research questions were driven by consumers?
I think we're seeing more of that. I really do.
Yeah.
I think it is
wonderful.
Yeah, because I think people are respecting that if it matters to consumers, it's probably better research.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angela. Now to Kathy. So, Kathy, from a pharmaceutical industry perspective, what has BMS done to involve the consumer or the patient voice in the global designs of your clinical trials?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle, and forgive me because consumer, as Christine knows, was a very new term to me for as far as the patient. So when we're referring to consumer, we're talking about the patient voice, and we do have several programs at BMS. One of them, which is led and driven by my engagement strategy team, which we do refer to as patient voice, and we do and it's being adopted much more broadly now. It has taken, I'll be very transparent, it's taken some time for our clinical research teams to get on board to the value, to understand that there may be some additional time in gathering these insights from patients prior to protocol development, but it will save time in the long run as far as enrolling the studies, because we're looking to these patient advisors, as we call them, to really understand their patient journey, their experience, their priorities, what their needs are, just looking at their own unique disease perspective to understand how we can develop our protocols to lessen the burden on them in them. We also have a group within our organization that's outside of my team that works with patient advocates, which we call peer or patient expert engagement resources. So these are the real expert advocates. They may not be patients themselves, but they are the ones advocating for patients. They are a little bit more expert in clinical trials. My team looks at a variety of patients that may have experience, that may have knowledge of clinical trials, they may not. So it really brings really different perspectives into what it would be like to participate for that type of patient, that person, from their unique experiences. So we do meet with them, and we meet with them advisory boards that we work through our patient advocacy organizations for outreach. So we have several methods of finding these patient advisors, the advocacy organizations. We also work with some of our site investigators to have patients self-identify when they want to be involved in developing protocols in the future, and they call in and they go through a screening process. But we find that they bring really valuable experience, information, and that our clinical scientists with that scientific lens, as somebody was mentioning, are not really looking and thinking about.
Has that led to changes in the design of research?
It has led to some changes, and when we're talking about metrics, this is a fairly new as far as consistent incorporation of this for us. So we are now, my team and the process and the patient voice is now endorsed by our senior leadership to be involved in our protocol review committee meetings to bring those insights forth. And so we were having trouble and are still looking at how are we going to capture these metrics. And one of our bigger focuses is not just capture metrics, but how we close the loop with the patients so that they're familiar, they're aware of what they brought to us, what value. And there are going to be cases, and there have been cases where we can't make changes that they may have wanted us to do because of something, of an endpoint that we need, or that protocol, what the purpose of that protocol is. So we want to make sure that we're also giving them, reasons why. And we've had those conversations, sometimes difficult, but in the end, they're realizing, we try to make them realize really what the objective is and why we may not be able to do that. But we've made changes to visit schedules, to procedures that may not be something that's going to help meet those primary objectives. And do we really need to do 3 of these, this procedure versus just one of them, and things like that based on conversations with them. So really value their input, and our study teams are starting to really understand and really requesting, can we get patient feedback? Can we get patient voice, or what does the patient thinks? So it's something that's really been being adopted, and I know with many of our industry partners are following it as well. So
Thank you so much, Kathy. I really, love the programs that you have and the positions that you have that are really looking into encouraging that patient voice in your research, and the fact that you're providing feedback. I think that's so important at the end, because it can be a negotiation at the beginning about, this is what the researcher requires, this is what the consumer or the patient requires, and how can we adapt it? But then beyond that, the feedback, and this is why we had to use this endpoint, or this is why we did include your feedback for this particular item. I think that's really valuable. And it really then highlights the contribution that the consumer or the patient has had in your research pipeline. So well done. Thank you.
We've just I know we're running over time, but just got one question for Lisa and Christine from one of our attendees. So Bronwyn has said, if I can just get her question up. So the relationship that you've described, Christine, with Lisa is a very one-to-one type scenario. Do you ever work with groups of consumers? So is there ever a need where you might need to interview a number of consumers for input, or is it generally just a one-to-one working relationship?
No, definitely. We have more than one. So Lee Hunt on the call is also one of my consumers too that we love working with as a team. So as the comments were raised before, getting different opinions and different consumers with different experience is really valuable. So I actually think that to a certain point, the more the merrier, because the more exposure we get and the more opinions, like always, that we can take on board and digest together as a team and as a group, the better it is. So yeah.
And just Rebecca's put a question to the panel as well. She's saying, how can we navigate involving consumers with our work if we have no project funding, e.g. as a PhD student with a very tight research budget?
Yeah, if I can say something, Sarah responded to this and I totally agree with her. A lot of consumers are not looking at money. They're looking at wanting to make a difference. So don't use the financial side of it as a barrier to being able to get consumers involved. Ask them if you can. And there is, this is a whole discussion. I know someone mentioned it before, but on the remuneration side and all of that, I'm seeing when I'm reviewing grants for grant review boards now, some of the applicants are actually putting money in the budget for consumer involvement. So there's that aspect of it as well. But yeah, it should not be a barrier.
Yeah, thank you, George.
Lee, did you want to add?
Yes, I just want to say, just very quickly following on to what Christine said, is that I started working with Christine when she came back from the US. Christine's a very prolific researcher. She wins or gains, not wins, she gains a lot of funding. And I put it down to Christine really wants to know what research is going to value the consumer. She has been involved me in right from the initial stages of the research where we brainstorm with Lisa, we discuss all the different projects that could be happening. So there's a real taking on board what we as consumers think is important to solve the problem of treating this style of cancer. So I just think that involving a consumer from the word go, and as a consumer, I never expect to get paid because my reward is seeing the gains that are being made in research and the fact there's going to be change. So I think many people think like that. I personally don't want to be paid because I think once you're paid, that could indicate that you're actually being influenced by that research and you might actually change what your opinion is. I think it's very important to keep an independent voice.
Wonderful, thank you. Any further question? Andy, we've got two hands up, Anne and Sarah. Anne.
Yeah, look, I just think on the payment side, I think this is a webinar on its own. And I think, many people here today have said they don't want to be paid. and that's fine. That's a point of view to be respected. But often what I've seen over the years is the consumer is the only person at the table not being paid, and therefore that may be considered to be devaluing of their expertise and experience, etc. So I think it's about respecting. Some people do want to be paid, some people don't want to be paid. I think it's about an offer. And very quickly, we started many years ago an involvement bank at Telethon Kids, and then I believe Curtin University have picked this up and run with it. An idea we nicked from the UK that a small amount of money was put aside for early career researchers or PhD students who wanted to involve consumers and wanted to offer payment, because this is what we're talking about. And so that money was there to be to fund those activities. It was always meant to be that if they got their funding for their grant, they were meant to pay it back. Well, I don't think anyone ever paid it back, but it's a great way of making sure that it's not a barrier, because I think we do have to respect that some people choose to accept payment, and that's okay too. Thanks.
Great points there, and thank you. Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, look, I was going to largely say what Anne was saying, and I think it's particularly important for diversity, that you don't only have consumers who can afford to not be paid. There's a socioeconomic equity issue there as well. But I also wanted to get in a cheeky question to Kathy Florek, if I could, as a panelist. It's something that comes up for international trials that will often have patient voice included in their establishment of those trials overseas. But when they come to other countries or even just to other sites, the actual trial sites themselves don't have a local patient consumer voice. And I was wondering if this is something that Bristol Myers Squibb is thinking about. I know in Australia, we're really hopeful of getting a lot more international trials into Australia, that the trials come to us in Australia and we don't have to travel. But although we have a shared language, Australia's not the US. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. We are working from to kind of a tiered approach to make sure that we are a fairly well-oiled machine, if I may, in the US and the way we're doing it. Then going to be working at it with our local country leads to help identify organizations that can help us find the patients locally, because we're not familiar with those organizations, or do we have those relationships? We have a global advocacy group that will help with that. So we're looking at that, pretty much country by country, and how to expand the patient voice work that we're doing. Our peer initiative is a little bit further ahead of that from a global perspective, because they do have resources outside of the US. My team is just resourced in the US at this point, so it's a matter of having some other BMS role resources to help us with that. But yes, that absolutely, and especially in countries where we are same language and there's not a translation type of for timing and cost. So we do, and I hear you all talking about remuneration for, we are obligated to pay our patients their time from an industry perspective. There's a fair market value to that. So, yeah, great question. And yes, absolutely know that this is something that we need to do, especially for our research studies that are primarily outside of the US, where we're looking for the majority of patients outside of the US. There is a different perspective that we're gaining from those patients versus US-based patients, for sure.
Thanks very much for that.
Sure.
Great question, Sarah. So I think we're almost 10 minutes past the hour now, over time. So I'd like to thank all our panelists today for their contribution and for sharing their views and their experiences on consumer involvement in research. Thank you so much for your time. Also to all the attendees that attended today. And also a quick thank you, as always, to Christine and Fiona, and also Deep Tea for helping behind the scenes to make this two-part webinar series a success. So thank you to everybody. One thing that the White Coats Foundation does plan to do is develop a reflections paper with recommendations from the outcome of discussions over the last two-part webinar series. So please visit our website for more information, and please also stay tuned to upcoming events that are coming through with the White Coats Foundation as well. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day, and sleep well, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.